Good morning, and thank you for joining the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom's conversation today on religious freedom in Algeria. My name is Dwight Bashir, and I am Director of Outreach and Policy at USCIRF. For those of you not familiar, USCIRF is an independent, bipartisan U.S. federal government body created by the International Religious Freedom Act of 1998, or IRFA, to monitor religious freedom abroad and to make policy recommendations to the President, Secretary of State, and Congress. Our work is led by 9 commissioners appointed by the President and the leadership of both political parties in the House of Representatives and the Senate, and is supported by a professional staff of about 20. Every year, we release an annual report documenting religious freedom violations in countries that USCIRF recommends the State Department either designate as a country of particular concern, also known as the CPC, or include on the State Department's special watch list. We also regularly publish country-specific and thematic reports on issues relevant to religious freedom globally. Today's discussion will focus on conditions in Algeria, a country that USCIRF has monitored for the past few years with concern. In our 2021 annual report, we recommended for the second consecutive year that Algeria be included on the State Department's special watch list for engaging in or tolerating severe religious freedom violations that met 2 of the elements of IRFA's systematic, ongoing, and egregious standard. I'm joined today by 2 of our commissioners, Chair Nadine Mayenza and Commissioner Fred Davey. We are also joined by 2 expert panelists, Daniel Hoffman, Executive Director of Middle East Concern, and Arif Asif, head of the French legal desk for the Ahmadiyya Muslim community. Today's event will begin with opening remarks from Chair Mayenza, who will provide a general background on religious freedom conditions, and then Commissioner Davey will delve into the latest on the challenges facing religious minority communities in particular. Then we'll hear from Daniel Hoffman, followed by Asif Arif. Afterwards, I'll moderate a brief conversation among the speakers. And then following that, there'll be time for some questions from the audience. Now, to ask a question, please use the Zoom webinar's Q&A function at the bottom center of your screen to submit your question in writing, which you can do at any time during the event starting now. It's now my pleasure to turn the floor over to Chair Mayenza.
Thank you, Dwight, and thanks to all of those who have joined us today, including our distinguished panelists, for this important discussion. As Dwight mentioned, in 2020, for the first time, USCIRF recommended that the State Department include Algeria on its special watch list for engaging in or tolerating severe violations of international religious freedom. We retained this recommendation in our 2021 annual report when religious freedom conditions in the country remained poor. The Algerian government routinely discriminates against religious minorities, including Christians, Jews, and the minority Muslim communities who do not conform to the mainstream Sunni Islam, such as Shia and Ahmadiyya Muslims, often asserting that they are not Muslim. In addition to placing specific restrictions on these communities, the government also exerts control over the Sunni Muslim majority. It directly hires and trains imams and places speech restrictions on religious leaders. The penal code criminalizes blasphemy, which can carry a sentence of up to 5 years in prison, in addition to financial penalties. Restrictions set in place in a 2006 ordinance on the regulation of non-Muslim religious groups also criminalizes proselytization, including prohibiting Algerians from, quote, printing, storing, or distributing materials that can shake the faith of a Muslim, with penalties of up to 5 years in jail. In 2019, Algeria experienced a political upheaval as popular protests demanded the resignation of the longtime president. And yet 2 years after this regime change, Algerians' hope for a government that will respect the freedom of thought and expression have been dashed as Algerian authorities continue to stifle opposition and enforce restrictive laws and policies. This is why it is so important that we have this discussion today to amplify the voices of those in Algeria fighting for human rights and guarantees for freedom of thought, belief, and expression. In this context, I want to turn this over to my colleague, Commissioner Davey, to discuss in more detail restrictions and discrimination against religious minorities in Algeria.
Thank you, Chair Mayenza. And I want to join you in thanking our fellow panelists and our audience for engaging in this extremely timely and prescient discussion. Trends of repression in Algeria are not new. In 2016, Algerian authorities refused to register the Ahmadiyya Muslim community as an association. And since then, the government has prosecuted more than 280 Ahmadis on account of their faith. Government officials have also made statements denouncing Ahmadis in abusive terms and have declared them, quote, non-Muslim, unquote. Since 2017, authorities have forced 13 Protestant churches to close, citing lack of registration, despite that these parishes filed for registration and never received a response from the government. Over the past year, Algerian authorities have continued to make and enforce decisions that restrict freedom of worship and prosecute religious minorities for expressing their beliefs. In the past several months, courts have charged individuals with blasphemy, proselytization, sentencing them to hefty fines and multi-year prison sentences. This prosecution impacts members from diverse religious minorities, including Ahmadiyya Muslims, Christian converts, and non-believers. The government has also continued to uphold decisions to forcibly close houses of worship where religious minorities sought to gather and practice their faith together. These are just the most egregious violations. Informants from the country report that religious minorities face societal discrimination and harassment by government authorities outside of formal charges. For a more detailed picture of the challenges facing religious communities in Algeria, I look forward to remarks from our distinguished panelists today, Mr. Hoffman and Mr. Arif. Daniel Hoffman, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Davey, and thank you to USCIRF as well for organizing this important panel discussion today. Middle East Concern is a partnership of different organizations that seeks to promote freedom of religion and belief in the Middle East and North Africa area, so including in Algeria as well. In February 2006, the government in Algeria issued so-called Ordinance 0603, which regulates the worship of non-Muslim religious communities. And what it does is it restricts religious worship to buildings that are specifically licensed for that purpose, and it criminalizes a number of different religious activities that, as the law says, shakes the faith of a Muslim, or could shake the faith of a Muslim, without further defining what that means. And since then, there have been several waves or several cycles of pressure and persecution on the Protestant Christian community and other religious communities as well, as has been referred to by the previous speakers, but I've been asked to focus on the Protestant Christian community. And unfortunately, currently, the Protestant Church is in the middle of another wave of this persecution. It started in November 2019, when many of the Protestant churches were visited by so-called health and safety commissions, which inspected their buildings, but also asked them to produce a license from a national commission that allows them to use this building as a place of non-Muslim religious worship. And as already has been mentioned, this commission has never ever issued a single license for this purpose. So none of these church buildings, these churches, could produce this license. And since then, actually the authorities have told 20 Protestant churches that they have to cease their activities, and continued to seal 16 of these 20 churches. The others are smaller gatherings that often met in a private home, and therefore the building could not be sealed by the authorities. In all the paperwork related to these closures, there was only one reason that was mentioned for their closure. No reference to health or safety violations or anything like that. The only reason given was that these buildings did not have the required license to function as a place of worship for a non-Muslim religious community. In addition to these closure of churches, as already was mentioned, there have been several people who have been charged and sentenced under the stipulations of the 2006 ordinance. Even this year, 2 Christians have been sentenced to prison for producing and storing and distributing written materials that could shake the faith of a Muslim. They both were involved in running a bookshop. And another Christian has been sentenced to prison for receiving illegal donations. Because of his conversion from Islam to Christianity, he struggles to find employment and occasionally has received financial assistance to take care of his living expenses. And therefore, he has been sentenced to prison again for illegally receiving donations for the purpose of evangelizing Muslims. At least that was the charge. And separate from the 2006 ordinance, in the last 10 months, there have been at least 3 Christians as well who have been sentenced to prison sentences and are serving their prison sentences for allegedly blaspheming Islam. Finally, there is also the recognition of the EPA, which is the legal umbrella of the Protestant churches in Algeria. They have been registered in Algeria since 1973, but in 2012, there was a change in the law on associations, and like every other association, the EPA, the Protestant Church in Algeria, had to refile for registration. Since then, they did not receive a response from the authorities. Actually, when you file a registration like that, you should receive a receipt from the authorities. And if you haven't received an answer within 60 days of the issuing of that receipt, then you can take further legal action. But the authorities refused to issue a receipt when the paperwork was filed. And the authorities never responded to the EPA, to the application, until in 2019, end of 2019, when under international pressure, they finally sent a response to the EPA and say, you need to change your constitution. Among other things, you have to add to your constitution that you will accept to abide by all the stipulations of the 2006 ordinance, and you have to write in your constitution that you will not publicly speak out against the government of Algeria. Basically, they had to promise that they would no longer seek to stand up for their rights where these were violated. And all of these issues are still ongoing at the moment. We have been trying to address this, including in our relationships with the American authorities. And we want to call on them to continue to raise these issues with the Algerian authorities, to call on the Algerian authorities to bring their rules and regulations in line with their obligations under international human rights law, and to have rules and regulations that facilitate the freedom to worship together and freedom to practice your religion. For the National Commission on Non-Muslim Religious Groups to license buildings for use by non-Muslim religious communities, including the Protestant Church of Algeria, for the government to reopen the churches that have been closed, and for the government to cease their prosecution of Christians for the peaceful exercise of their religious beliefs. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel, for those insights. Why don't we turn it over now to Asif Arif to talk to us about the Ahmadiyya Muslim community in Algeria.
Thank you, Dwight. And I'm very grateful and thankful to all the USCIRF team to letting me be part of this brief actually on Algeria. It's really important. I mean, I think Algeria is one of the area which is not discussed much in international forums, but is a big challenge in terms of human rights and a big challenge in terms of freedom of association and in terms of criminal law reform. And those are the 2 points that I actually want to talk about today and put them into perspective with what is happening with Ahmadiyya Muslim in Algeria. So the Commissioner Davey actually said that in 2016, the Ahmadiyya Muslim community, which was exceeding at that time 1,600 members, was filing for an association named Ahmed Al-Khair, and they got denied for being an association in Algeria. In fact, 2016 is a good day to remember when we think about the concept of religious freedom, and especially when it touched ground with the Ahmadis. But in 1927, there were already a letter coming from the press that was already mentioning the Ahmadiyya Muslim community. So the ties of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community race way back when Algeria was not, in fact, Algeria. Then after a very unique member of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community actually worked on the independence of Algeria, which is Sarzafullah Khan, and those who work on Pakistan, I think might know this personality very well. So in order to understand a little bit the concept of what is happening with the Ahmadis in Algeria, I think we need to understand the former legal background and the actual legal background, because the actual legal background is bringing challenges that USCIRF can actually address. The former legal background is the following. You have a 2006 law that the former speaker already mined, yes, and this 2006 law is not even defining what an association is. So we had to wait till 2012 for having an actual definition of what is an association. But right after the definition, the Algerian legislator put a limitation, and this is the main source of problem. The limitation is as follows, is the association shall exercise its purpose within the limits of the general interest of Algeria and shall not have a purpose against the national values and the public order disposition. So this is a very general, you find that in many, many constitutional law systems, but the fact that Algeria is referring to values, we don't understand what are the Algerian values. What are the Algerian values has been majorly documented. We will say it's Islam, Arab, and Amazigh, who are the three, the triptych that is being applied when it comes to Algeria, but still there is no either constitutional or legal definition of what is the Algerian values. And based on that limitation, a lot of association got denied. In fact, before EPA become recognized, they were being denied most of the time. This is the 2012 law, and then after they bring the issue also through the Universal Periodic Review to Algeria, and many pressure that has been made to Algeria in the EPA for the EPA to have seen the day of the light in Algeria, and many other Christian and Protestant church are still under this minority threat. And concerning this 2012 law, I think I will stop here because there is too many things to say if I continue with this 2012 law, which is drastically incoherent if you look at it in deep. But let's focus on what are the challenges ahead and this reform, this constitutional reform that happened in 2020. And I think this is a major issue that we need to focus on, because the constitutional reform in 2020 that happened after the popular movement of youth in Algeria, it's called the Hirak, they brought this referendum about changing the constitution, and the new constitution has already been adopted, and the modification that took place within the Algerian constitution has to be set by an organic law that has to be adopted normally counting from September, so tomorrow. But according to the new legislation, now if you look at the constitution, and more particularly the Article 53 for the freedom of association, it is written clearly that there is no prior authorization that has to be sought from the government. But up to today, all the religious association, in fact, Ahmadis themselves, has to follow the formal 2012 law, which is having a bailiff, having a very complicated way of incorporating the association, and that leads to many criminal convictions. So up to today, Ahmadis, you have conviction. Ahmadis are in appellate court in Khashla. They are in appellate court in Batna. They are also in appellate court in Tiaret. They are in Tizi Ouzou. The appellate court did not rule yet and will have to rule on the 26th of September. And in Adrar. Adrar was a part of the desert in Algeria where, because this south region is a very strategic region for Algeria, there is also very much wider human rights abuse that happen when it comes to minorities such as Ahmadis. And I think this the USCIRF should continue this work on Algeria, and more particularly to work on this 2020 constitutional reform that have been adopted in December 2020. And in fact, there is many good things in the new constitution if you apply them by the letter. But we are afraid that the Algerian government will do whatever the same will play the same game that they were playing with the 2012 and 2006 law, which is construing these legislative reform in a very narrowly interpreted legal framework, and then asking people for more authorization, for more approvals, and going to waliyas or going to and making this distinction in between national association, international association. So there is, I think, a good basis here. And also Algeria is a signatory of the ICCPR, of the African Charter of Human Rights, of the Arab Charter of Human Rights. The UN Special Rapporteur has already mentioned the fact that freedom of association is not really respected in Algeria, and there is also UPR engagement. And I would like to mention here UPR is very important because the review of Algeria is upcoming in January 2022, and this is also a good way to raise attention on violation of human rights. And finally, just in few words about the criminal conviction and the blasphemy law. I mean, it's called that way, but there is many disposition in the Algerian criminal code. And mainly those dispositions are the Article 11 of the 2006 law. There is Article 144 bis 2 of the criminal penal code of Algeria, and that Amnesty International and many international human rights organizations already draw the attention on the fact that violation has been made. The offense on the Holy Prophet of Islam, for example, is being construed in a very political manner, in such a way to make sure that minority are not able to either incorporate or practice their faith. And this is very important because neither the Ahmadi has the right to incorporate their association, so declare themselves to the government as Ahmadis, so they're denying the identity of Ahmadis of being an Ahmadi, but also they are being denied their religious identity by the fact that they cannot practice anything, because if they practice anything, they're going to be convicted under the Article 144 bis 2 or the Article 298 paragraph 3 of the Algerian code. Sorry, it was a little bit sometimes just to mention a few articles, but it's mainly about defamation and about the fact that somebody is calling Islam in the wrong way, and this being interpreted by court. There's many court decisions in always a way that is prejudicial for minorities, and more particularly in my case for Ahmadis. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And just for the sake of the audience, when you said UPR, just to specify, the Universal Periodic Review, which is a mechanism of the UN Human Rights Council that every member state undergoes every 4 years. So that's coming up, always an opportunity. to highlight some of the abuses and violations. Thank you both for laying the groundwork. What I want to do now is launch into a few questions, but let me remind the audience that now is a good time, if you haven't already, to ask your questions on that Zoom webinar Q&A function there in the bottom center of your screen in writing. If you could go ahead and start submitting those after we have a few questions here, I'll turn to those questions from the audience. One of the interesting things that you both touched on, obviously, is the 2006-2012 laws, the ordinance. And I recall, as I'm sure Daniel does, and I'm sure Asif as well, when this law came into place, and there was, some people that were charged, particularly the Christian community, Protestant Christian, there weren't any prison sentence handed down. There were mainly either fines or just suspended sentences. And of course, this went on for some years. Things quieted down until we saw the Arab Spring period, where there was a lot of pressure on the former president there, Bouteflika, who eventually held on and resigned in 2019, April 2019, with the hope, as Sif, you talked about some of those reforms coming into play that came about. But I'd like to ask you both, really, we now start seeing at the end of 19 the church closures, the particular targeting of non-believers in the Ahmadiyya Muslim community. Why all of a sudden, in a period when the president of 20 years steps down, the hope for reform is strong? What are some of the factors at play that there is this targeting all of a sudden at a heightened level that I can't recall in the past 15 plus years? If you could shed some light from your different perspectives, that would be very helpful.
What I think about all the circumstances in Algeria is Algeria is having the Hirak going on at that time. There was many political challenges because Bouteflika was in place for quite a long period of time, we can say, and the population needs to be distracted, and I think that was the main idea of behind whatever is happening, is to find a common enemy, and those common enemy are being found into the idea of minorities. But the thing is, the political background and the intelligence services, because what we need to understand is you have the political move of the state, and you have also the intelligence services in Algeria that are pretty strong. And I think it's mainly coming from the intelligence services, who always go intimidate people when they make a mosque or when they gather together. They go ask them question: what are you doing? Why are you doing? So I think all these flagging the minority is a good way to draw the attention of people that we have a common enemy, and our common enemy is not the state, is not the process of democracy, which in fact it is. We don't have a proper democratic system in Algeria, and they try to draw the attention towards something that is not a problem, in fact, and try to shed light on minorities where all they want is just an association, in fact, and pray and be able to gather together. And you know, sometimes it's very heartbreaking, because when you talk with the Ahmadis in Algeria, for example, when you ask them what is happening, he said, we are the most faithful for Algeria. We're ready to do everything for Algeria. In fact, the fire happened, and many fund was collected by Ahmadis themselves. And they went door to door, house to house to help those people. And I think the government is really playing the wrong move. And it's my humble opinion on this, that this is the reason behind. But maybe Daniel can shed more light on it.
Thank you. No, I think you are absolutely correct in the comments that you made, and I think we saw already in the run up to the elections where former President Bouteflika was still planning to run in those elections. There were a lot of unrest, if you like, in the country. A lot of people who are unhappy with the government, and if you look at the speeches by government officials, you will see they try to unite the country, or they try to promote a vision of Algeria as a country that is an Arab country and that is a Muslim country. And I think both of these are important because, of course, there is unrest in the Kabylie area where people are ethnically Berber and not Arab. And in the case of Christians, possibly the Ahmadiyya as well, many of the Christians are ethnically Berber. And not all of them. There are Algerian Arab Christians as well, but the large majority of the Algerian Christians are ethnically Berber. And that, I think, puts them under a lot of scrutiny from the government as well. They want to make sure that anything that threatens that vision of Algeria as a Arab and Muslim country, anything that could challenge that needs to be repressed by the authorities. And as the unrest increased and as the people unhappy with the government increased in number as well, the harder the government was trying to crack down on, as I said, anything that could threaten that vision of a united Algeria. Although, as Asif already mentioned, the Christians as well would consider themselves faithful citizens of Algeria. They are not seeking to overthrow the government or do anything against the country of Algeria or the state. But they are at times perceived to be a threat to the interest of the state.
Well, let me ask the next question, because as you said, with the election and these promises of reform and the deteriorating broader human rights, but certainly religious freedom situation, it seems that the Algerian government right now has not been particularly responsive to the international community in raising some of the concerns. Daniel, you mentioned earlier that the U.S. should continue to speak out and engage their Algerian counterparts. But I'm just wondering if you have any other recommendations here. Obviously, where you sit, I see France is a big partner of the Algerian government. Are there any specific thoughts as far as U.S. policy or broader in the international community that to highlight these things? We know a UPR is coming up, so there's opportunities to highlight these things. But beyond awareness, what would you recommend for the U.S. and other governments who have these close relationships?
You see, I think Algeria is such a country where a frontal approach, which is a direct approach of condemning them on an international public scene, is not going to work. And France have seen that quite a lot of time in the past. And today, France's position is they don't want to engage too much on Algeria because they have already many things going on. And to be fairly honest, if you ask France if they have something going on with Algeria, there is always something going on with Algeria. So it's very hard to find the proper window with France, to get a little bit into that problem. But still, we have that problem. And that problem is mainly also the fact that religious communities, I don't know about Christian, but for Ahmadis, for sure, they cannot speak to the government. And that's a big issue. They are Algerian citizens. It's not a diaspora coming from other countries, Pakistan, for example, and settling in Algeria. Those are Algerian born and raised citizens. And all the Ahmadiyya community in Algeria are Ahmadis from Algeria, born and raised. And the fact that they're writing letter upon letter to the government, and the government is not even giving them the opportunity to express themselves, is in fact a repression of their free speech, of their possibility to talk with the government, and of a bias of democracy. So there is a problem in that verticality of religious minorities are not able to reach out the government. So that's the first problem that we're assessing in Algeria. Now, how to tackle it? I think the only way to tackle it is through the ambassadors that we have in the US. So the ambassador of Algeria in the US, if the government is not responsive, has to explain to Ahmadi citizens living in the US why they're doing that with their brothers. Why is that happening? And not to criticize their government and not to criticize however they deal with their citizen, but at least to remind them that they signed the additional protocol and the ICCPR, and they have international commitments. And that comes at the end of the day, Dwight, to the question of soft law, right? We have an international law that is very much a soft law, which is not possibility, having no mechanism to impose on countries the possibility of react. So the only way is a diplomatic way, but with a strong wording and a strong way of saying that you need to listen to those people because you signed these international covenants. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, maybe I'm slightly less doubtful about the influence of international pressure, Dwight, if I may. As I mentioned in my introductory remarks, this is not the first time the Protestant Church in Algeria goes through a cycle like this. And in the past, usually what instigated a cycle was if there was complaints, if you like, from inside Algerian society, where people said there are so many Algerians who are becoming Christians and the government is not doing anything against them, and then the government would step in and try to more forcefully apply the 2006 ordinance and put pressure on the church, and then there would be pressure from abroad on the Algerian authorities, and after a while they would reduce the pressure on the church. And even in the current cycle, we saw in 2020, after there was a concerted effort and coordinated effort from different countries in the international community to address these issues with the Algerian authorities. Actually, the Algerian authorities stopped closing new churches for a while, and they actually reopened 3 of the churches that were closed. The courts acquitted a number of Christians who were being prosecuted. And as I mentioned earlier, for the first time ever, the government actually sent a response to the EPA, to the churches, regarding their application to have their association re-registered. But then kind of Algeria moved to the background a little bit. Other things came to the foreground, and countries focused on other things and less on Algeria, and they slipped into their bad habits, if I may say that. So again, so I wouldn't say pressure doesn't help. I think it does help, but it needs to be sustained until there is the result that we're looking for. And again, we are not looking for, and the EPA is not looking for countries like the United States of America or France or other countries to try and harm Algeria or to speak badly about Algeria, but they want to encourage Algeria to abide by and implement the obligations that they chose to submit themselves to by their own free will, like the ICCPR and other international law.
Thank you for both your comments. Those are very helpful on insights there, certainly. One last reminder for those, thank you for those that are submitting questions. Please use that Q&A function, submit your questions. Before I turn to the audience, I do want to give Chair Mayenza and Commissioner Davey an opportunity to jump in any reflections, questions, or comments at this time.
Thank you so much to both of you. This has been so interesting and so informative and disappointing to see this growing repression against religious minorities in Algeria. And you touched a little bit about the public, and it seems like that the government is using these laws to try to divide the community. But I was curious about, the public opinion and how the climate is towards religious minorities. And is that getting worse? And the government just represents that, or is the government trying to make it worse?
Thank you for it's a great question. I mean, the general public, what I think is actually what I heard from Algerian people when I talked to them is there is the policy and there is the general public.
Right.
Yes, the general public is very much more open and much more understandable. But the fact is that even though the general public is much more genuine with Ahmadis or with Christians, they don't raise voice for them, or they don't go up to the government to make a positive change about it. So the fact is the status quo is still there. We are not able to build mosques. We're not able to have an association, even though the general public, that's right. I mean, everybody is not against minorities. When you talk individual one-to-one to persons, they all said, yes, you're great people. You're doing great for the communities and around, but we don't want to get involved in Algerian matters because they know also they can face pressure. They can face threats, intimidation. So I think they just don't want to get too much involved with the policy overall.
Understood. Thank you. Really interesting.
Thank you. Yeah, I think as in most countries, the general public is divided on some of those issues. You have, of course, more Islamic oriented parties, also political parties, and conservative religious leaders within the Islamic community who publicly speak out and try to pressure the government on taking actions against religious minorities. But you have many people as well who either are neutral or are positive. There is now the Hirak movement, which is more in general, I think, trying to promote freedoms and democracy. If you like, they often do not specifically focus on or mention freedom of religion and belief, but more democracy and freedom in general. You have in many local communities as well, a lot of communities are supportive of the Protestant churches and possibly the Ahmadiyya as well. But then at the same time, if you may have families who in general would not have a negative attitude towards Christians or maybe Ahmadiyya, but then one of their children comes home and says, I have decided to convert to Christianity or I've decided to become an Ahmadiyya, they may still not be happy with it. So there's a whole scale and a whole spectrum of attitudes towards these things.
Understood. It's complicated. Thank you so much to both of you.
I want to thank both of you also for your comments and very enlightening presentations. I'm curious about the constitutional changes that you mentioned that have taken place, that took place in 2020, and whether or not those changes, as they relate to religious freedom, if that's how we can describe them, have any real are points of leverage for creating a more hospitable climate for religious minorities in Algeria. You mentioned sort of the international agreements that Algeria has, as you said, of free will signed on to as points of leverage. Does the Constitution also provide points of leverage, and how seriously is it socialized throughout the country?
Yes, thank you, Commissioner David, for this remark. And yes, I agree. The constitutional change is a major change, and it is a marker on the fact that if the population is actually going into the street, it can make some positive political change. And this constitutional revision, is normally has to be implemented with the organic law. So the organic law has to be adopted by the new legislature, which is normally now starting working in September, October. And it will depend now where they put the human right question, because if they put it in the beginning of the debates, that will be in the next couple of months. But if they want to not address the human rights question, it's very simple for the Algerian government to do so. they will just push back on the agenda the human right question, and they will say, no, adopt the organic law much more at the end of the legislators, so we have time to reflect, we have commission, it's very easy to use the administrative imbroglio in order to put people into loops of commissions and discussions and debate, especially within the parliament. And I think the leverage that we have, yes, is the fact that we have a positive constitutional change in the Article 53, especially for freedom of association. Because I think all the criminal conviction that you're watching in Algeria stems from the impossibility for those religious minority to incorporate as association. So this is fundamental to deal with this freedom of association in order for them to break that spiral of a conviction into the criminal courts. So I think, yes, we have a leverage, and I think USCIRF has an actual voice there. And in fact, when Daniel has mentioned it earlier on, yes, he's right. I'm a little bit, reserved on the international mechanism, but in fact, Daniel is right, and I need to give credit to the U.S. caucus on Algeria, because they write a letter back in 2016 to the Algerian ambassador in the US. And in fact, the Algerian ambassador in the US replied in a very detailed manner back to the caucus. But it was a letter that the ambassador was confused himself in legality and legal term and big principles and all that. But when you come on the ground, like for example, let's take this very concrete and practical example for Ahmadiyya Muslim community. They're saying now, let's say that this constitutional change happened. We want to go to a waliya, which is a local department, go there and tell them, here is the bylaws or the article of incorporation of our association. Please register us. And because we don't need any prior approval since the new constitution take place, we are now an association, but they can still deny it. They can still act as they never received the documentation. So there is a lot of challenges on the ground. Those particularities lies with the particularities of Algeria legal system. And that's why I think the question of democracy, of the movement of youth that coming for democracy, is very much intertwined with all this religious freedom and all the fundamental human rights. So at the end of the day, I think that works out for the benefit of freedom of religion.
Yeah, as you've said, there are some positives in the new constitution, especially in the language regarding human rights and freedoms, etc. in general. But every constitution needs to be interpreted, and every constitution needs to be translated into lower level laws or organic laws, as you've mentioned. When you go to court, or when you are charged before a court by the authorities, it's usually on the basis of these lower level laws, not directly of the constitution. And so far, I think we have not seen, and I don't think there is a lot of hope and anticipation that in the very near future, a lot of the current legislation that is causing these difficulties, like the 2012 law on associations, like the 2006 ordinance regulating non-Muslim religious worship, that a lot of these laws will change and will be either scrapped or amended in the very near future because they conflict with the new constitution. I think even if you look at the recent court cases, there was no change in the verdict. Church buildings were still closed. People were still sentenced to prison for violating either the blasphemy laws or ordinance, or the 2006 ordinance, regardless of the new constitution. So I don't think, it's definitely something that can be raised with the authorities and say these laws and these practices violate or seem to contradict the new constitution. But I don't think on the short term there is a lot of expectation that these things will change because of the new constitution.
Thank you.
Thank you for those insights. So there's been a few questions, which I think you've touched on a bit regarding societal views of religious minorities, the different groups, including the non-believers. But a broader question, which I think, Daniel, you touched on in particular, is what is the Iraq movement's position on this? It sounds like they've been more broad on democracy and maybe human rights, but if either you had any insight on, a question specifically is there a downside or negative implication for the movement and the government to shifting its stance to protecting freedom of religion or belief, not just for minorities, but broadly? Is there some downside, or is there, in some of these countries we've seen, obviously, over the years, more of a conservative element that's putting pressure to not, bring in groups that they would see as part of the people of the book, so to speak, or otherwise. Is there any downside right now since there's this broader movement? A couple of questions have come in along those lines.
Yeah, I want to begin with the Iraq is not an extremely centralized movement, of course. So I'm sure within participants and even within the leadership, to the extent that exists, of the Iraq movement, you may have different opinions on the issue of freedom of religion and belief, and what kind of freedom non-Muslim communities, or those who are perceived to be non-Muslim communities, should have. As I think it was already mentioned before, freedom of religion and belief doesn't seem to be a big talking point among the demonstrators and among the spokespeople for the Iraq movement. The government is pushing back against the Iraq movement itself as well. Of course, several of their leading members have been put in prison or have been arrested, etc. So the government is pushing back against the movement as such, and I think the government is becoming more nervous again against what I mentioned before, their vision or their desire to unite Algeria and Algerian society along the lines of Islam and the Arab identity. Of course, there is a lot of support for the Iraq movement among the Berber communities as well. And again, that although the government may pay some lip service to, yes, we hear what you are saying and we want to address some of these issues, I think in practice, if you look at what the authorities are doing, they are pushing back against some of these things that they see are destabilizing the unity of the country and the unifying message of Arab identity and Islamic identity for Algeria. So I'm not sure if in the short term, actually the Iraq movement will lead to a lot of positive changes for the Protestant churches. It may even make the government more reluctant to, if you like, give in to some of the demands, or to give too much freedom to the Protestant Christian communities, because they are afraid of if they start giving in to some of these demands, that there may be more demands, and there may be more demands from other communities as well.
About this particular problem of having a downside of basically letting the minorities being free and having no problem with it at all. I think there is one issue with Algeria is the size of the country and the number of border that they have. Algeria has Libya as a border, has also Mali as a border. And they are a major actor in the region in the counterterrorism as well. So having this narrative against the minority for safeguarding the Islam is also a way for them to unite people in the war against their interior terrorists. So I think there is all this narrative that is being developed by the government as well in order to keep the population united in this many front. So for example, those two Ahmadis that were arrested in Adrar, we were in fact more afraid that they're being arrested in a region where there is a lot of terrorism issues. So in this province or in this region, in this particular region, the judge took more than a year before holding a hearing on the bail or granting bail or not on these two Ahmadis. Sometimes he had a knee that is not well. Sometimes he had a back pain. Sometimes he's going to hospital. So there was always good reason. I mean, I hope he's well, and I hope he has no problem. But I think there was many information that was giving to us on the ground, saying that these are method by the judges. Lawyers are often telling us to delay cases, to grant continuance to cases, and this is another way also, to deny religious freedom to many minorities. Today, I think there is more than 200 cases in Supreme Court of Algeria for those Ahmadis, and I'm not counting Christian and Protestant and all that. So I think there is also this idea of a common enemy is multiple. There is multiple things that are coming in, that are jumping in, and I am confident on the fact that this war against their own terrorists in the southern part of Algeria, and now they're also having problem with Morocco and all that. So this is also a way to unite their people against other external issues that they have, as well as internal issues.
I wanted to throw one more question out there that came from the audience regarding, are there any best practices? As you recall, the one question has to do particularly with Tunisia, but we've seen somewhat a backsliding, the history there of the Ennahda movement that eventually stepped back and the process was going, but we've seen some kind of breakdown. Are there any Muslim majority countries in the region, North Africa or other parts of Africa or the MENA, Middle East region, that could be seen as helpful in this? I know that's a tricky question, but there's some interest in what your thoughts are based on your experience covering the region. Is there any hope for best practices anywhere nearby?
That is a very difficult question because the situation of I will speak for the Christian community, is very different. In Algeria, the whole of the indigenous church, the Protestant church, are considered to be converts from Islam to Christianity. Although some of them are by now probably third generation, so their grandparents actually are the ones who became Christians and then raised their children as Christians, and they consider themselves Christians, and now they have children who they are raising as Christians. But in the eyes of the authorities and in the eyes of society, they are, at least from a legal point of view, still considered to be Muslims. And that's always an especially difficult category, so to speak. In a number of countries, you will see some relaxation or some improvement in the situation of Christian communities, of, say, Christians who were born as Christians. But I think it's difficult to be very hopeful or very optimistic on and say there is a country where we saw a significant improvement in the situation of people who are at least considered to be converts from Islam to Christianity. That would be, there's no country that would come to my mind, unfortunately.
Yeah, I think I will join Daniel on this. I mean, if we look around the border of Algeria, you have Morocco. There is almost so much going on with Morocco right now at the moment that it is almost bad for us to even think about this, the country as resolving an issue of minorities. Tunisia is facing tremendous challenges as well at the moment. And it was one of the main hope was Tunisia, but now Libya is Libya. And Mali and other countries, they're facing the terrorism issue in the north, and Algeria being a very important actor in counterterrorism. All these countries need Algerian as allies in this war for avoiding destabilization. I mean, Mali is pretty destabilized already. and I think there is no hope for around the Algerian countries. But I still think that the U.S. can be a major actor in this in solving this issue, and the European Union can be also a very important and substantive actor in when we take the European Union as a whole, not individual countries which will have too much Western interest involved and too much other interest involved. So I think the three main countries on which we can rely for Algeria to change a little bit the standard on religious freedom is the U.S., the Canada, because Canada can be a good also actor into this area, and the European Union.
Well, we'll have to leave it on that optimistic note. Hopefully there can be some real progress with the influence of those governments and others. But I want to thank both of our commissioners today, Chair Mayenza and Commissioner Davey, for leading this important and timely conversation. Of course, both of our panelists, Daniel and Asif, for their expertise and insights on this, very complicated situation evolving in Algeria. I also want to thank Madeline Velturo, USCIRF's policy analyst who covers Algeria, as well as Danielle Ashbahian, our supervisory public affairs officer, for their work on this event. If you'd like to learn more about USCIRF's work on Algeria, I encourage you to visit our website at www.uscirf.gov. We look forward to hosting similar conversations on other countries and issues in the months ahead. Thank you all for tuning in, and we'll see you next time on USCIRF Conversations. Have a good day.